you have basically two varieties of conflict. One is what you call the traditional variety or the orthodox variety, where basically you have mostly military conflicts. And the military conflicts would be followed by some kind of conflicts like insurgency. And in the traditional variety, you have four varieties of conflict: state versus state, state versus group, group versus group, and within the group. So setting that aside, what we are going to discuss today is a non-traditional variety of conflict. And in the case of the non-traditional variety of conflict, unlike the traditional variety where the conflict is blatant, in the case of non-traditional variety, it is basically what you call the conflict is sometimes latent. In the non-traditional variety, I think the four triggering factors, right, that bring forth conflict in a kind of a latent and a blatant manner, of course, is what we have seen now is one factor is the globalization and the new actors. This morning also we're discussing about the localization of globals and what localization of globals lead to changes from culture to environment to displacement, water, food, ethnicity, identity. That's a major triggering factor. The second factor, of course, is what you call the burgeoning gap between the prosperity and inequality. China is facing that. India is largely facing that. I see that happening in a number of Himalayan states, including Nepal and Bhutan, and of course in Burma also. Then the third, of course, is the third triggering factor has been what you call the real unprecedented stress on natural resources and livelihood practices. And one who travels across the mountain regions, I see in depth how the livelihood practices have undergone some kind of structural changes. And the last factor which is likely to trigger and which has already started triggering is what you call the governance failures. You know, the people's aspirations are going on one direction, the institutional values and institutional corrective measures are going in another directions, and third, you will have a total mismatch between what the states would like to do for the people and what people would like states to do for them. There's a mismatch. Therefore, today we are going to discuss all these issues, and to discuss this, we have a very eminent panels. Nicholas from China, the UN resident representative. So I would start with Nicholas. I would like to ask you, Nicholas, about where do you think really peace, security, and sustainable development intersect? That's my first question. My second question to you would be, as an actor in the United Nations organizations, what do you think are the changing nature of conflicts? You have been working across the globe, so you would be telling us about what kind of shapes and sizes the conflicts have started taking place. And my third question to you would be, you have a grand initiative in China known as One Belt, One Road initiatives. And these initiatives will not only crisscross continents, geographies, communities, cultures, economies, and what do you see? What are the conflictual dynamics or the conflictual potentials of this, or will there be some kind of elements that would mitigate conflict? So these are the three basic questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. I'll answer your questions, but first maybe just step back a little bit and say, from a United Nations perspective, why is this so important, the topic of this panel? And I'll go back to the UN's charter, which really is the basis in terms of the shared work and global public goods around the world, and the common humanity that we all have to protect and defend. And this is, the Charter is really founded on peace and security, on development, and on human rights. And it's a very inclusive charter. It's for the people, and therefore it's people-centered. And I think for those of us working in the United Nations and for the member states of the United Nations, I think it's always important to remember why we do the work that we're doing. And I think maybe to start answering your question, the previous Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, said we can't have sustainable peace without development, and we can't have sustainable development without peace. So I think this is the starting point for any discussion on peace, security, and development. We see shifting forms of conflict. Many are man-made, but I think increasingly, perhaps due to impact of climate change and more variable weather conditions, as well as other reasons, increasingly we see incidents of very serious natural disasters which hit rich and poor countries alike. Asia region is actually the most affected, and if you look at both in terms of fatalities in the last 20 years or in terms of cost of damage, almost every single year Asia region is at the top of the list. So certainly incidents of natural disasters is critical around the world and in Asia. And when we talk about disasters and conflicts, I think our first thought, of course, is the human cost, which is where we should be focusing, of course. But I think once we're looking at how to recover from that and to build back better, we also have to look at some of the economic costs, these environmental costs that are incurred. We're talking, for example, about 124 million people around the world who are food insecure, who don't have enough to eat, 124 million people. And that in itself is potentially a creation of conflict within societies, and certainly a cause of instability in societies. So I think we have to look at the impacts, human impacts, but the economic impacts and the environmental impacts, and increasingly, what climate change will do in terms of increasing risks and increasing vulnerabilities for communities. I think conflict is a cause of stunted development. I mean, it reduces opportunities for development. It increases risks for people who are investing in economic development, and certainly derails human development achievements in many situations. And at the same time, lack of development can also create conflict. So it's a two-way correlation. Both conflict has a very negative impact on development, and lack of development, lack of investment in inclusive development increases risks of conflict. So it works both ways. The 2030 agenda for sustainable development, the sustainable development goals are very much an agenda focused on issues of exclusion and disparity. And I think in a way it's a very powerful agenda when we are looking at issues of conflict, and when we need strong arguments to invest in development to reduce conflict. I think again the 2030 agenda gives us a very strong framework to operate within. And when one looks across the 17 goals, there's a lot there about governance, about inclusion, and about reducing inequalities. And I think that's important. And it goes beyond traditional aid, to stereotype it a bit about health, education, water supply, which is extremely important for any society. And it goes into how do we create jobs, how do we industrialize, how do we build the infrastructure. And it's really the first time a member states or universal development agenda covers the whole spectrum of development, from the hard investments, let's say, to the soft investments in human development. Now, the 2030 agenda is ambitious, it's universal, and it's expensive, but I think we're talking about $5 to $7 trillion a year, $750 billion a year on additional infrastructure in Asia alone. But I mean, this can be financed, and we heard some of the options before lunch from impact investing and the private sector. And we also have to look at what else is coming up, and I think one of them is the Belt and Road Initiative, which you mentioned. And I think we are very helpful in the sense that it's offering new solutions to development for groups of countries which have not benefited from large-scale investment in the past, that the Belt and Road can actually be an accelerator for the Sustainable Development Goals. It's investing in parts of the world which traditional investors haven't usually gone to. If one's looking across parts of Central Asia, the Horn of Africa, and so on. And it'll help to provide much more options to many of these countries. It's also providing blended finance. It's bringing in the private sector as well as state underwritten investments. And it's providing potential funding investment in industrialization, which countries need. Without employment for youth, again, you create conditions for instability and so on. So I think the potential impact of the Belt and Road is very positive. What we want to see is that the investments are taking into account the social consequences, they're socially responsible, and that they're green investments. And in the UN in China, as well as in other countries, we're working very closely with China and Chinese investors, as well as with the receiving countries, to see how we can assist in terms of advice and cooperation to look at these issues around environmental and social standards. So I think, just to finish, there's very strong interconnection between peace and development. And we need to deal with the root causes that bring them together. We need multidisciplinary, community-based approaches that ensure that we do get inclusion and not just projects that do not benefit people at large. And we can see the Belt and Road as an accelerator, with the UN supporting in terms of capacity development and standards, particularly in the receiving countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. Very interesting observations, particularly in the context of what comes first, peace or sustainable development. Now let me come back to our own theater in the Himalayan region. And we have Mandira Shrestha from ICIMOD to interact with us. I would like to again pose 3 questions to Mandira. First, of course, is, we have this great debate on climate change and its impact on the mountain regions. And scores of literature now produced by ICIMOD, number of institutes in India, Bhutan, right, and China. And we could also see that there is some kind of a convergence of opinion among the policymakers. Yes, we really have to work together on a cross-border basis. So my question to you, Mandira ji, is first, of course, is could you kindly tell us what kind of trans-border environmental injuries the Himalayan regions are facing or likely to face first? Secondly, would you also please tell us what have been the community's responses to such kind of unprecedented or non-traditional changes? Are the communities become hostile, and how are the communities really reacting with the state and the governmental system? And my third question is, what do you think about the disaster management institutions coming together in the regions? For example, how does National Disaster Management Authority of India would work with similar kind of institution here and what kind of interventions they make. Say, for example, quickly, I saw the NDMA, the top institution in India, sending its entire force in Darjeeling tea garden, I think about 3 years back, to rescue, for a rescue operation, massive landslides. Large number of people died. And when I reached there just to see what happened, I saw them using very basic instruments to dig and find dead bodies. And I was asking, such a huge institution using basic instruments like a villager to do that. So that really brings in much, much larger issues about technological innovations and interventions. So if you could kindly make observations on these 3-4 critical issues, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mahendra-ji. Very good afternoon to all the distinguished participants, as well as the organizers. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel, this August panel, and I'm honored to share some of my experiences of what you just heard Mahendra-ji talk about. Now, zooming into the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, what I would like to first say is that there are several issues that have been identified while talking about resilience. And this was something that we had in this HIMAP work that has been mentioned several times earlier this morning. So what are some of those key issues that the Hindu Kush Himalayan region really faces when we're talking about crisis or when we're talking about disasters? So those 5 issues, let me just list them. The first one is that, as was also informed earlier, we live in a multi-hazard environment. There are different types of disasters that bring in crisis at different occasions in our region, whether it's floods or whether we are talking about droughts or earthquakes. Now, the second point that is very much important is that there is a very close link between what happens in the upstream and what happens in the downstream. So the impacts that you see in the downstream is very much affected by what is being done in the upstream. So that linkage is very much important to keep in mind. And this is not only when you are looking at smaller basins, but also at the transboundary level when we talk about floods. Now, the third factor that we have also been highlighted this morning is the issue of climate change. Climate change is a reality, and one of the primary mediums that it manifests itself is through water. And there's a great variability in terms of its availability around the year as well as across seasons. Now, the fourth point, extremely important for us in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, is regarding connectivity. And this is also one of the major themes of our summit here in terms of access to different remote areas in the region, in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. What are those means, and how do we reach out to those, especially in terms of crisis? And the fifth point, again highlighted earlier, is the need to have good governance. Often things fail when there's poor governance. And I'll give you some examples where there could have been good governance mechanisms, good institutions that could have come into place, which would have saved much lives. Now, going to the transboundary aspects. Now, one of the disasters that I want to zoom in is the floods issue. Now, floods, as you know, transcends across borders. There's no borders there. And vulnerabilities are also shared across borders. So when the floods occur in Nepal, it goes down to India and down to Bangladesh, and really impacts the entire region. And one of the things that is very much important and has been highlighted is the need for regional cooperation for the countries to come together and really share the data and information that is there to really save lives and property downstream. Now the question is, has this been happening? Or how far has this happened? Where are some of the gaps? Now, along that line, we are working together with the 8 regional member countries. Particularly, I'd give you an example of a program that I'm leading called the HICOS, which brings together 6 countries that share the Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra basin. And there, we are looking at sharing of data and information. And here, this is hydrometeorological data, which is extremely sensitive in the region. So we brought these countries together and really built the trust and confidence in terms of enabling them to have a flood information system and share that information. And that is where platforms and regional cooperation comes together. That's what ISIMOD offers, and where the countries can really build that trust and confidence. So that's that one example that I would like to show. And not only that, you already heard a lot in terms of technology. Technology plays a key role. Because when you're talking about regional cooperation, one of the biggest questions that are asked is, what do we benefit from it? Particularly the upstream countries. What do we benefit from sharing data and information to the downstream countries? So one of the things that we could look at is also technology transfer. We're bringing in advanced science, technology tools, for example, monitoring of our rivers, how high the water level is getting, how much water is falling, and this could be transmitted on real time and shared on a real-time basis in order to save lives. And this is what has been happening in the region, which I'm very proud of to share with you here today. Now, this is at the national and the regional level. So when you're talking about this, there are different levels that we can engage with. The other part is at the community level with the local people. So there are different kind of opportunities. Now again, it's a matter of scale that you're looking at. For larger river basins, you could look at it at the transboundary regional scale of sharing and data information. But at the very local level also, this also holds. I will give you an example of what happened last year in 2017 floods, where there was massive floods. Massive floods across borders. And a simple, low-cost technology in the Ratu River was able to save lives and properties of many that were living in that small basin. And this was possible by a simple community-based flood early warning system, which we have been able to pilot together with UNDP and as well as the government of Nepal, and worked with also the Bihar government, the local state department, disaster management authorities to make that happen. So that's just some simple examples that I wanted to share with you. Now, while looking at it in terms of, the further looking forward, I'd like to go back into the HIMAP chapter. There we have proposed some kind of a framework to looking at disaster risk reduction. And in that framework, we talk about the 4 I's. There are different I's that we can talk about, but here we talk about the 4 I's. Particularly, I think much has been said in other presentations also. So first I is information. Information is extremely important, as we just heard. Then we have also institutions. Institutions play a key role in terms of sharing of data, having proper mechanisms, whether formal or informal at the local level. The other point is infrastructures. We heard this morning about different types of infrastructures, gray or green infrastructure that could be put in place. Then the fourth point that was very much highlighted earlier is the insurance, which we also very much debated on earlier this morning. So this is a framework that we have proposed for the disaster risk reduction in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, which brings in the various levels of engagement from the very high regional level down to the local level. And here I'd like to remind ourselves also to the Sendai Framework, I think has been said regarding the 2030 agenda, but Sendai DRR Framework is equally important for us to take stock of and remember, because that is where we talk about the 4 frameworks in terms of understanding risks. We're looking at good governance. We're looking at bringing in a lot of investments in this particular sector, as well as building back better. So very strong institutions are a must, and I think this is the way forward.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting enunciation about how to mitigate conflicts. We have Renaud, the country director of UNDP here. He brings with him absolutely a brilliant set of experience. In the conflict resolution processes across the Himalayas and of course in the region as a whole, we have found that states may not be as effective as it used to be in the past, precisely because the very nature and structure of conflicts have started undergoing changes. So I would like first Renaud to address about something like on non-state actors. What are the non-state actors that could come up and help the state in mitigating conflicts? Secondly, how do we build a new varieties of confidence building measures? The older variety is basically military-centric, orthodox, security-centric, but what it requires today is absolutely a different set of confidence building measures, maybe something on the soft power line, on culture, on education, on science, on technology. And the third, of course, Renaud would be, of course, working on all these issues. Can we think of a regional civil society where, cutting across the boundaries, civil societies could come up with some kind of measures that would talk about? So I would like to ask this first new set of actors in the second question I would like to I would like to ask Renaud about his own initiatives on what you call the natural and the human's conflict, and interventions on something on glaciers. Because we think for us in the mountains, glaciers is not just glaciers. It denotes spirituality, it denotes science, it denotes to a large extent nature, and of course education. So he would tell us about how his initiatives on glaciology has started bearing fruits on some kind of a conflict resolution. And third, of course, point is very critical on which he has been working, his institution has been working, is governance, right? What kind of new models of governance could be adopted? So for example, in India, after so many years of, so many decades of quasi-federalism, Government of India is now talking about cooperative federalism. What does it mean for us? And in Nepal, you have a new set of federal units. How does governance start new federalism? So if you could kindly highlight these 3-4 issues.
Good. Thank you very much, Mahendra. I see that you've kept the easy questions for the end, so thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to be back at the Himalayan Consensus Summit, and thank you, Sujeeva and Lawrence, for re-inviting me despite my awful prestation last year. You run a risk, though, because you've invited 2 UN officials on the same panel, so I could just rewind and replay what Nicholas has said, and I would be quite safe, but I think I have to answer some of those questions. But I'll start with another question, an answer to a question that many of you have asked me since yesterday evening, which is what is this? What are those colors? What is this colorful pin that I'm wearing? And it goes back to the Agenda 2030. These are 17 colors which each represents the 17 goals of Agenda 2030. I mentioned this because, as Nicholas pointed out, it is the first time that all countries, all member states of the UN have agreed on a common agenda. And when you look at the issue of conflict, having already from the get-go a common agenda, having agreed on a set of objectives that we all share, that we all have in common, might sound very simple, but is an extremely powerful tool. And it does avoid a lot of misunderstanding from the beginning, because we all have the same directions to follow. So that's an important point. The other one is, Mandira has mentioned 4 I's. I will mention 5 P's. We have our specialties. 5 P's, they are the pillars of the Agenda 2030. And they are so interestingly relevant to everything that we've been discussing under the Himalayan Consensus Summit framework. The first one is people. And linking to the second one, which is planet, which is exactly that link that you asked about. How do we cohabit, live in the environment that was given to us on this planet? The third and the fourth are peace and prosperity. Right? It's really about how do you articulate this issue that Nicholas articulated very well about peace, development, peace. Right? And the fifth one is why we are here together. You cannot do all this without partnerships. Right? So these are the 5 pillars, the 5 P's that really set the basis for Agenda 2030 and the 17 goals that to me is a unique opportunity, and that really is already in itself a mitigating factor for conflict and crisis around the world. Now on this link, I want to take 2 examples. I'll get to the glacier, but the first one I want to go back to what the Swiss ambassador mentioned, reminded us this morning that yesterday was World Water Day. And water, as we know, and David told us this morning, that about a fourth of the total global population relies on water coming from this region. But 2 billion people today still do not have access to safe drinking water. In Nepal, we estimate about 3 million people do not have this. And of the total population, less than half have access to piped water. Right, so still, a basic fundamental need and right is denied to so many people. But more importantly, maybe, an analysis recently concluded that by 2030, about 40% of global population will be in a situation of scarcity of water. 40% of the world's population. Now, we've been meditating about water and wars based on water issues. But that issue of scarcity of water, and with that amount of people deprived from it, is slightly, to say the least, worrisome. Imja Lake is a glacier lake up in the Himalayas. It's at more than 5,000 meters high. And Mandira mentioned there's a partnership between the government of Nepal, the UNDP, funding from the Global Environment Facility, and ICIMO technical support. There was an urgent need to drain this lake because of the melting of the glaciers. And there was a very strong risk of rupture of the natural dam and, of course, huge floods downstream. Not easy to conduct civil engineering and civil construction at more than 5,000 altitude. I have no engineering background, and I discovered that all your equipment don't work. And you can think of a lot of the technical solutions when you're down here in Kathmandu, but when you try to apply them at that altitude, it's a completely different story. So that was one of the big issues. But the second big issue, which I think is more important and relevant to the conversation, we didn't see this, but when we started up there, choppering the equipment and the people who could not stay too long because of altitude sickness, the local community came and started creating problems. We did not foresee that this lake also had a very strong spiritual value, with gods living in the lake. And we were disturbing the lake. So then the trade-off between, if we don't do what we are here to, you run the risk of being flooded downstream, or are we not going to disturb the gods of the lake, was an interesting debate. And we were not prepared for this. Right? So to me, again, it shows how a technical approach to a natural, not disaster yet, but hazard, right, has to be compensated by this social, cultural, spiritual approach, which is fundamental to development and which is sometimes we have a tendency to forget or to downplay. So a big lesson for us was the importance, and it won't surprise anyone who is in development, the importance of including the community directly affected by the project from the very beginning, from the design of what it is that we wanted to do. So this inclusion aspect leads me to another point on the governance side that you've asked, Mahendra. As you all know, I mean, especially the Nepalis in the room, the country here adopted a new constitution in 2015 that really, from a paper analysis, provides a lot of rights, a lot of very, very positive improvements for Nepal on the governance side. In 2017, it was a year long of elections. We had local, provincial, and federal elections in the same year. All went much better than a lot of people had expected. And today, we see the unfolding of a federalization process. And for us in the development community, looking at this from the principle of subsidiarity, bringing to the lowest level possible decision-making processes. A lot of progress has been achieved on the agenda of inclusion. We have 14,000 women who have been elected in decision-making position across the country. First time in the history of this country, and a huge jump compared to a lot of other countries around the world. But when we start digging a little bit deeper, right, we realize that despite those good numbers, we're still very far from where we have to be. If you take at the House of Representatives, where we have 90 women, only 6 were actually elected following the first past the post methodology. meaning that the others were there because of the quota system. Nothing wrong with this, but that's a reality. Another indicator that I want to use, not related to gender, but related to caste, which in many countries in the region still remains a big problem. The Dalit community in Nepal is about 14% of the total population. We have 753 local governments. If you do the maths, you should not get to the result where only 5 mayors are from the Dalit community. So this issue of inclusion has its limitation and therefore has its consequences, you know, when you talk about social cohesion of a country where the diversity of its population should be its richness and not its main risk when you look at conflict prevention or crisis prevention. The third point I wanted to really stress is how, despite all the good policies, institutions, laws, regulations that you can pass, all this is not going to work unless you really put the emphasis, again, back to the first P, back to the people, and to the mindset of the individuals. In today's Kathmandu Post, there's a very good op-ed called Time Change, Mindset Don't. I encourage you to look at it. It's really interesting because it picks up on all those issues and how despite all the good progress that the country has made, there's still so much on the agenda. The social, the cultural, the spiritual dimension of development cannot be ignored. Another example that illustrates this, how Mount Everest, which is cherished by everybody in this room, in this country, in this region, as one of the most beautiful sites on Earth, we actually had to launch last Saturday a cleanup campaign because all those hikers who go there, and there's about, I think, 30,000 to 40,000 every year who go, you know, and do the trekking all the way to base camp and sometimes further up. They leave behind hundreds of tons of non-biodegradable waste. Again, despite rules, regulation, fines, incentives, all kinds of system, but the mindset won't change. So how can you rely to the most beautiful mountain and then you drop your bottle of Gorkha beer as soon as you refresh yourself after a long day of work? All right, so with our partners from Yeti Airlines, and I think they'll be on a panel tomorrow, we are committing to bringing back down 100 tons of the non-biodegradable waste down from the mountain to Kathmandu and then recycle them with local partners. So again, the involvement of the community on this is absolutely tremendously important because they are the ones who collect the waste and they're all volunteers. Right? You don't need to actually retribute them for the service. I've started with the SDGs, I'll close with the SDGs and zoom in on SDG 16, which is the governance SDG, and 2 of the targets, which speak, you know, on its own on their importance. 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. Without this, crisis prevention, crisis mitigation is extremely difficult because you're talking about, again, non-state actors and the role that they are playing. And 16.10b, promote and reinforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. In other words, you don't have peace, you don't have development, and vice versa. And we're back to Nicholas's main comment. I'll stop there.